The F-22 Raptor screamed through the Afghan sky at 37,000 feet, its twin engines hemorrhaging fuel at an alarming rate. Major Valentina Nightingale Kozlova watched the fuel gauge plummet from the observer's seat, her medical bag forgotten beside her boots. She wasn't supposed to be here. Combat medics belonged in field hospitals, not strapped into America's most advanced stealth fighter during what was rapidly becoming a suicide mission. "Fuel's critical, Nightingale," came the pilot's voice through the intercom. Captain Marcus Blade Rodriguez had been skeptical when command assigned her to this reconnaissance flight. A nurse with flight experience was an oddity, especially one who'd been grounded for 3 years following an incident nobody talked about. "We're going down whether we like it or not." Below them, the Hindu Kush mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks sharp as broken glass against the morning sun. Valentina's fingers traced the worn leather of her flight jacket, feeling the faded wings embroidered there. Wings she'd earned in another life, before everything changed. Before the crash that killed her squadron. Before they stripped her of her pilot status and handed her a stethoscope instead of a stick. "There's an emergency strip 15 clicks northeast," she said quietly, studying the terrain with eyes that had mapped hostile territory for 7 years before her exile to the medical corps. "Valley floor, natural wind break from the western ridge." Rodriguez's helmet turned slightly. "How the hell do you know that?" She didn't answer immediately. The mountains held secrets just like she did. Intel reports crossed her desk in the field hospital. She'd memorized every airstrip, every landing zone, every possible extraction point from Kandahar to Kabul. Old habits died hard, even when your wings were clipped. "Trust me," was all she said. The fuel warning light bathed the cockpit in crimson. Rodriguez's breathing quickened over the radio. She could hear it in the subtle changes of his exhalation pattern. Combat stress manifested differently in pilots than ground troops. She'd treated enough of them to recognize the signs. Fear had a sound, a rhythm, a signature as unique as a fingerprint. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Blade 77, Rodriguez transmitted to base. "Declaring emergency, fuel critical, attempting emergency landing at grid reference." He paused, looking at his instruments. 294.7, 086.2, Valentina supplied without hesitation. Static crackled through their headsets as they descended toward the unforgiving landscape below. Neither spoke of the obvious truth hanging between them like morning mist. Combat medics weren't supposed to know classified grid references by heart. Only pilots memorized terrain that precisely. Only pilots who'd once been something more than they appeared to be. The mountains rose to meet them, keeping their secrets close. Rodriguez killed the engines and began their glide toward an uncertain fate. In the sudden silence, Valentina closed her eyes and remembered what it felt like to truly fly. The F-22 shuddered as they dropped through 20,000 feet, and she opened her eyes to guide them home. The irony wasn't lost on her. The nurse was about to save the pilot who'd questioned her presence. But then again, she'd been saving people long before she'd learned to heal them. The emergency strip appeared through the morning haze exactly where she'd said it would be. Rodriguez's hands tightened on the controls as he realized the implications of her impossible knowledge. The woman beside him wasn't just a combat medic with flight experience. She was something else entirely. "Gear down," she said softly, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who'd landed damaged aircraft in hostile territory before. "Flaps full. You've got this, Blade." The runway rushed toward them, a narrow ribbon of hope carved into the valley floor. Rodriguez felt the aircraft respond to his inputs with the dying grace of a wounded bird. Beside him, Nightingale sat perfectly still, her breathing controlled, her hands steady. She watched the terrain markers with the focused intensity of someone reading familiar text. 50 feet, she called out, though the altimeter was directly in front of Rodriguez. 30, 20, flare now. The Raptor touched down hard, bounced once, then settled onto the makeshift strip with a grinding screech of protest. They rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust and burning rubber, the engines finally silent. For a long moment, neither moved. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and the distant whistle of wind through the mountains. Rodriguez released his harness with shaking hands. That strip isn't on any map I've ever seen. Valentina unbuckled her medical bag and checked her equipment with practiced efficiency. Maps don't show everything, Captain. She looked through the canopy at the familiar mountains, remembering other landings, other missions, other lives. Sometimes the most important things are the ones nobody talks about. She popped the canopy and breathed the thin mountain air. It tasted like memory and regret, like chances lost and found again. Rodriguez climbed out behind her, his legs unsteady. She steadied him with one hand, the gesture automatic, professional. "How long were you a pilot?" he asked quietly. She shouldered her bag and began walking toward the communications equipment they'd need to signal for rescue. "Long enough to know that every landing you walk away from is a good one." Her voice carried across the valley, steady and sure. "And long enough to know that sometimes the sky gives you a second chance." Rodriguez watched her check their radio gear with the fluid competence of someone who'd done it countless times before. The morning sun caught the faded wings on her jacket, and he began to understand that Major Valentina Kozlova was much more than she appeared to be. The nurse who'd guided them to safety had once been something else entirely. Something the mountains remembered, even if the official records had been buried. The rescue frequency crackled to life in her hands, and she began transmitting their position with the precise coordinates of someone who'd never really stopped being a pilot. She just learned to heal instead of hunt. But the sky still knew her name, and the mountains still called her home. Rodriguez keyed his radio and looked at the woman who'd saved his life with knowledge she wasn't supposed to possess. "Base, this is Blade 77. We're down safe, thanks to Nightingale." He paused, watching her adjust the antenna with practiced hands. "She guided us in perfectly. Whatever her file says, she's got more flight hours than any medic I've ever met." The response from base was immediate and telling. "Blade 77, understand Nightingale assisted with landing. Please confirm her status and location." Rodriguez frowned at the unusual request. Standard protocol didn't require confirmation of medical personnel locations unless there were specific security concerns. He glanced at Valentina, who had gone very still beside the radio. "Base Nightingale is secure and operational. Why do you need confirmation?" A long pause filled the mountain air. When the voice returned, it carried a weight Rodriguez didn't understand. "Blade 77, Major Kozlova is flagged for immediate debrief upon recovery. Maintain visual contact until extraction arrives." Valentina's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She continued adjusting the radio as if she hadn't heard the transmission, but Rodriguez caught the subtle change in her posture. The relaxed competence had shifted into something more guarded, more careful. "Copy base. Nightingale remains with me." She finally looked at him, and he saw something in her dark eyes that made him understand why Command had flagged her file. There were stories buried in those eyes, missions that lived in classified folders, decisions that had consequences beyond what appeared in official reports. "You were never just a medic," he said quietly. She keyed the radio again, calling in their exact coordinates with the precision of someone who'd done countless combat extractions. "No," she said without looking at him, "but being a medic is what I am now." The distinction hung between them like the morning mist beginning to burn off the valley floor. Rodriguez realized he was looking at someone who'd been deliberately hidden, reassigned, buried in the medical corps for reasons that went far beyond a simple career change. The mountains kept their secrets, but the radio frequencies told a different story entirely. 30 minutes later, the distinct thrum of rotors echoed off the valley walls. Two Black Hawks approached from the southeast, flying in tight formation. Rodriguez shielded his eyes against the sun and counted the aircraft. Standard extraction protocol called for 1 helicopter. 2 meant either additional personnel or enhanced security measures. "Expecting company?" he asked. Valentina packed the radio equipment with efficient movements, her medical training evident in the careful way she secured each piece. There's always company when certain people surface in certain places. She shouldered her pack and walked toward the designated landing zone she'd marked with signal flares. "The question is whether they're coming to extract us or debrief us." The lead helicopter settled onto the valley floor, rotor wash kicking up a storm of dust and debris. 6 figures emerged from the passenger compartment, 4 standard extraction personnel, and 2 others in different uniforms. Rodriguez recognized the insignia of Air Force intelligence. Major Kozlova, the intelligence officer, approached with confident strides, his voice carrying clearly over the dying rotors. "Colonel Matthews, Air Force Intelligence, we need to discuss your knowledge of this location." Valentina stood perfectly still as the dust settled around them. The morning sun caught the faded wings on her jacket again, and Rodriguez saw something shift in her expression. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of resigned determination. "My knowledge comes from medical evacuation routes I've memorized from field hospital deployments," she said evenly. "Standard protocol for combat medics in hostile territory." Colonel Matthews smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Medical evacuation routes don't typically include classified emergency strips built for special operations aircraft. The second Black Hawk circled overhead, maintaining overwatch. Rodriguez felt the familiar weight of being caught in something larger than a simple equipment failure and emergency landing. He looked at Valentina and saw her watching the circling helicopter with the calculating gaze of someone who'd been in similar situations before. "Captain Rodriguez," Matthews continued, "your mission report will be classified pending our debriefing with Major Kozlova. You'll return to base on the second aircraft." "Respectfully, sir, Nightingale saved both our lives. Whatever questions you have can wait until." "Captain," Valentina's voice cut through his protest with quiet authority, "follow your orders." The way she said it carried the unmistakable tone of someone who'd given orders herself, someone who understood the weight of command decisions and their consequences. Rodriguez realized he was seeing another layer of the woman who'd guided them to safety, another piece of a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with each revelation. She walked toward the waiting helicopter without looking back, her medical bag slung over one shoulder like the burden it had always been. Rodriguez watched her go and understood that Major Valentina Nightingale Kozlova was about to disappear again, just as she had 3 years ago when they'd grounded her and handed her a stethoscope instead of flight controls. The mountains witnessed her departure in silence, keeping their secrets as they always had. The second Black Hawk descended as the first lifted off, carrying Valentina toward whatever debriefing awaited someone who knew too much about places that didn't officially exist. Rodriguez climbed aboard the extraction bird and watched the valley disappear below them, wondering if he just witnessed the end of someone's carefully constructed new life, or the beginning of something else entirely. The debriefing room at Bagram Air Base was sterile white walls and harsh fluorescent lighting, designed to make people uncomfortable. Valentina sat across from Colonel Matthews and a woman who'd introduced herself only as Agent Morrison. Between them lay a manila folder thick with documents and photographs that made Valentina's chest tight with old memories. "Operation Silent Wing," Matthews said, opening the folder to reveal reconnaissance photos of the exact valley where they'd made their emergency landing. "February 2019. Your squadron was tasked with mapping insurgent supply routes through the Hindu Kush. Highly classified mission that ended with 3 aircraft lost and 7 personnel killed." Valentina kept her expression neutral, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I'm a combat medic, Colonel. Whatever operations you're referencing occurred before my current assignment. Agent Morrison leaned forward, sliding a photograph across the table. It showed a younger Valentina in flight gear, standing beside an F-22 with Phoenix stenciled below the canopy. Captain Valentina Phoenix Kozlova, call sign Phoenix, squadron leader, 94th Fighter Squadron, one of the Air Force's most decorated female pilots until the incident that killed your wingman. The photograph hit her like a physical blow. She remembered that day, the confidence in her stance, the pride in her eyes, the absolute certainty that she was invincible, before she learned that even the best pilots could make mistakes that echoed through eternity. Phoenix died in that valley, she said quietly. Nightingale was born there. Matthews consulted the file. Official report states pilot error resulted in collision with mountain terrain during adverse weather conditions. But your emergency landing today suggests intimate knowledge of terrain that wasn't included in any mission briefing from 2019. She finally looked up from the photograph, meeting his gaze directly. I survived that crash, Colonel. My wingman didn't. I spent 4 days in those mountains before rescue found me. You learn every rock, every ridge, every possible landing site when you're trying to stay alive long enough to honor the dead. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Agent Morrison made notes on a legal pad, her pen scratching against paper like a countdown timer. Your medical training began after the incident, Morrison observed. Accelerated program, exemplary scores, immediate deployment to combat zones. Unusual career path for a former squadron leader. Healing seemed more important than hunting after I watched good people die because of my decisions. Valentina's voice carried the weight of 3 years spent trying to balance the scales. Every life I save in that field hospital is a small payment on a debt I'll never finish paying. Colonel Matthews closed the folder and studied her face. Today's emergency landing demonstrated flight knowledge and tactical awareness, consistent with someone who never stopped thinking like a pilot. Your radio protocol, terrain navigation, and decision-making under pressure suggest continued operational capability. She understood where this was heading. The careful questions, the classified photographs, the sudden interest in her background. They weren't here to punish her for knowing classified information. They were here to recruit her back into the world she'd left behind. I'm a medic, she repeated, but the words sounded less certain than before. You're a pilot who learned to heal, Matthews corrected. There's a difference. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, marking time in a room where past and present collided like aircraft in a storm. Valentina looked at the photograph of Phoenix one more time, remembering what it felt like to believe she could fly through anything, survive everything, protect everyone under her command. She'd been wrong about the last part, but maybe, just maybe, she could learn to be right about it again. The briefing room door opened, and a General Valentina didn't recognize entered with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. 2 stars gleamed on his shoulders, and his expression carried the weight of decisions that affected entire theaters of operation. Major Kozlova, he said, settling into the chair across from her. General Harrison, Strategic Operations Command. I've been following your career with great interest. Valentina straightened instinctively, muscle memory responding to senior officer presence. Sir. Your file makes fascinating reading. Exceptional pilot grounded after a mission that officially never happened, retrained as a combat medic, deployed to the most dangerous forward operating bases in Afghanistan. Remarkable adaptation to circumstances beyond your control. He opened a different folder, this one containing technical drawings and aircraft specifications. We have a problem that requires someone with your unique combination of skills. Project Lazarus, resurrection of damaged aircraft through innovative repair and modification techniques. The Air Force needs pilots who understand both how aircraft work and how to fix them when traditional methods fail. The drawings showed cutaway views of various military aircraft, their internal systems highlighted in red where modifications could be made. Valentina recognized some of the specifications: experimental avionics packages, enhanced fuel systems, structural reinforcements that could extend operational capability far beyond design parameters. "You want me to design field modifications for combat aircraft," she said, understanding beginning to dawn. "We want you to save aircraft that would otherwise be written off as total losses," Matthews clarified. "Your medical training gives you a unique perspective on repair and recovery. You understand how to diagnose complex system failures and implement solutions under extreme time pressure." Agent Morrison slid another photograph across the table. This one showed a heavily damaged F-16 sitting in a maintenance hangar, its fuselage twisted and engines destroyed. This aircraft was declared irreparable by 3 separate engineering teams. "We'd like you to prove them wrong." Valentina studied the photograph with the analytical eye she developed treating critically wounded soldiers. The damage looked catastrophic, but she could see patterns in the destruction, systems that could be bypassed, structures that could be reinforced. Her mind began automatically calculating repair sequences and resource requirements. "What's the timeline?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. It revealed too much interest, too much of the pilot who'd never really died in that valley 3 years ago. General Harrison smiled. "As long as you need. This isn't about speed, Major. It's about possibility. We want to know if aircraft can be brought back from injuries that would kill them under normal circumstances." The metaphor wasn't lost on her. They were asking if she could perform miracles on metal and composite materials the same way she'd learned to perform them on human tissue. Resurrection through understanding, healing through innovation. "What about my medical duties?" "Your medical experience enhances your value to this project," Harrison replied. "Understanding how living systems respond to trauma gives you insight into how mechanical systems might be repaired beyond conventional limitations." She looked at the damaged F-16 again, seeing past the twisted metal to the aircraft it could become. Phoenix had been buried in that mountain valley, but maybe Nightingale could learn to make broken things fly again. The choice hung in the air like morning mist, waiting to be burned away by the rising sun. 3 weeks later, Valentina stood in Hangar 18 at Edwards Air Force Base, wearing coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid and aircraft grease. The damaged F-16 sat before her like a patient in surgery, its access panels removed to expose the complex network of systems within. "Structural integrity is compromised along the primary load-bearing frame," reported Technical Sergeant Williams, her assigned assistant. "Engineering says the stress fractures make flight impossible." Valentina ran her hands along the damaged fuselage, feeling for weak points the way she'd learned to palpate for internal injuries. "Engineering looks at what's broken. We need to look at what still works and build from there." She'd spent the past week studying the aircraft with the same intensity she'd once applied to medical textbooks. Every system, every component, every possible failure point mapped and understood. The F-16 had been wounded in a hard landing that should have killed it, but like many wounded things, it possessed hidden reserves of strength. "The frame can't support normal flight loads," Williams observed. "Then we don't use normal flight loads." Valentina opened her laptop and displayed the modification plans she'd developed. Redistributed stress patterns, reinforcement where it matters most, and acceptance that this aircraft will never be what it was originally designed to be. The plans showed a radically altered internal structure, with new support frameworks that worked around the damaged areas rather than trying to repair them. It was surgical thinking applied to aviation engineering. When you couldn't fix something, you found ways to work around it. "This is unprecedented," Williams said, studying the technical drawings. So was performing surgery in a combat zone with equipment designed for field hospitals, Valentina replied. Sometimes unprecedented is exactly what the situation requires. She picked up a wrench and began removing damaged components, her movements efficient and purposeful. Each piece told a story of stress and failure, but also of potential resurrection. The aircraft had been declared dead by conventional standards, but conventional standards had never encountered someone who understood both healing and flight. "Hand me that composite patch," she said, pointing to a section of advanced materials she'd requisitioned from the experimental division. "We're going to teach this bird a new way to carry weight." Williams passed her the materials and watched as she began implementing modifications that existed nowhere in official maintenance manuals. "Major, what if this doesn't work?" Valentina looked up from her work, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "Then we'll have learned something important about the limits of resurrection." She returned to her work, applying the patch with the same careful precision she'd once used to suture battlefield wounds. "But I don't think we're going to fail." The hangar echoed with the sounds of reconstruction, metal against metal, compressed air hissing through pneumatic tools, the steady rhythm of someone who understood that broken things could be made whole again if you were willing to imagine them differently than they'd been before. Outside, the California sun tracked across the desert sky, marking time for an aircraft that was slowly learning to live again. 2 months into Project Lazarus, Valentina stood before a review board of senior officers and civilian contractors, her presentation slides displaying the impossible: a heavily damaged F-16 that had not only been repaired, but enhanced beyond its original specifications. "Operational ceiling increased by 8,000 feet, she reported, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd proven skeptics wrong. "Maximum G-load tolerance improved by 15%. Range extended through improved fuel efficiency and reduced weight." General Harrison leaned forward in his chair. "The aircraft that was declared irreparable is now performing better than factory specifications." "Trauma forces adaptation," Valentina explained, advancing to the next slide showing stress distribution patterns. "By working around the damaged areas, we created more efficient load paths through the airframe. The injuries became opportunities for improvement." Colonel Matthews consulted his notes. "Test flights have been successful." 17 test flights, all parameters exceeded expectations. She couldn't keep the pride from her voice. "The aircraft handles differently than a standard F-16, but pilots report enhanced responsiveness and stability." Agent Morrison spoke from the back of the room. "What's the operational designation for this modified aircraft?" Valentina had been waiting for this question. "Phoenix-class modification. Designated F-16P," she paused, meeting the eyes of everyone in the room. "Resurrection through innovation." The name carried weight beyond its technical meaning. Phoenix rising from ashes, aircraft rising from destruction, pilots rising from the graves of their former selves. Everyone in the room understood the symbolism, but only Valentina understood the personal significance. "Major Kozlova," General Harrison said, "we're prepared to expand Project Lazarus to include other aircraft types. We want you to head the program." The offer hung in the air like a challenge issued by the sky itself. Leadership position, unlimited resources, the chance to prove that broken things could not only be fixed but made better than they'd ever been before. "What about field deployment?" she asked. "These modifications need combat testing." "We were hoping you'd volunteer for that as well," Matthews replied. "Phoenix 1 needs a pilot who understands both its capabilities and limitations." The room fell silent as everyone waited for her response. Through the conference room windows, she could see aircraft moving on the runway, fighters launching into the desert sky, transport planes carrying supplies to distant bases, helicopters practicing medical evacuations that might save lives in places where death seemed inevitable. She thought about the valley where Phoenix had died and Nightingale had been born, about the men who hadn't walked away from that crash, about the promise she'd made to honor their sacrifice by saving lives instead of taking them. But maybe honoring the dead meant more than just healing the wounded. Maybe it meant proving that things thought lost forever could rise again, stronger than before. "I accept," she said quietly. The room erupted in discussion about timelines and resource allocation, but Valentina heard only the whisper of wind through mountain valleys and the distant sound of engines calling her home to the sky she'd never really left. 3 days later, she sat in the cockpit of Phoenix 1, running through pre-flight checks with the methodical precision of someone who understood that every switch, every gauge, every system indicator represented the difference between life and death. The modified F-16 felt different beneath her hands, more responsive, more alive, as if the trauma it had survived had awakened something that had been sleeping in its original design. "Phoenix 1, this is Tower," came the voice through her headset. "You are cleared for takeoff, runway 27, weather conditions optimal." "Tower, Phoenix 1, ready for departure." Her voice carried across the radio frequencies with the steady confidence of someone who'd found her way home after years in exile. "Request permission to demonstrate Project Lazarus capabilities." "Permission granted, Phoenix 1. Observers are standing by." She pushed the throttles forward and felt the aircraft respond with eager acceleration. The runway blurred past her canopy as Phoenix 1 lifted into the desert sky, climbing through the morning air with the impossible grace of something that had died and learned to live again. At 10,000 feet, she began the test sequence that would prove whether resurrection was truly possible. The aircraft responded to her inputs with precision that exceeded anything she'd experienced in conventional fighters. Every modification she'd made, every innovation born from understanding both healing and flight, translated into performance that redefined what was possible. "Tower, Phoenix 1, she transmitted, her voice carrying a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal redemption. "All systems performing beyond specifications. Project Lazarus is confirmed successful." Below her, the desert stretched toward distant mountains that held memories of crashed aircraft and fallen pilots. But above her, the sky opened endlessly, welcoming back someone who'd learned that sometimes the best way to honor the dead was to prove that broken things could fly again. She rolled the aircraft into a victory pass over the runway, where observers tracked her progress with instruments that confirmed what her heart already knew. Phoenix 1 wasn't just repaired, it was reborn. The radio crackled with congratulations from the ground, but Valentina heard something else in the frequencies. The voices of wingmen who died in a mountain valley, finally free to rest, because their squadron leader had learned to save the things that seemed beyond saving. She climbed toward the sun, carrying their memory into a sky that had never stopped calling her name. 6 months after her first flight in Phoenix 1, Major Valentina Kozlova stood before the largest gathering of military aviation personnel she'd seen since her squadron leader days. The audience included pilots, engineers, medical personnel, and senior officers from every branch of the armed forces. Project Lazarus had grown from an experimental program into a revolution in military aviation maintenance and modification. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying across the auditorium with the authority of someone who'd proven impossible things possible. "We are here to discuss the future of aircraft resurrection and the pilots who make it happen." The presentation screen behind her displayed statistics that seemed too remarkable to believe. 67 aircraft restored from total loss status, 43 pilots returned to active duty after being declared medically unfit for flight, and a 94% success rate in field modifications performed under combat conditions. Project Lazarus has taught us that our definitions of irreparable and impossible need revision, she continued. When we approach damaged aircraft with the same principles we use to treat wounded personnel, we discover capabilities that exceed original design specifications. In the audience, she spotted faces she recognized, pilots she'd saved, engineers she'd trained, medical personnel who'd learned to think like mechanics. The program had created a new breed of military professional, people who understood that healing and flying were different expressions of the same fundamental skill. The Phoenix-class modifications have been deployed to 7 combat theaters, she reported, advancing to the next slide showing operational data from real missions. Aircraft availability rates have improved by 37%, and mission success rates have increased across all categories. General Harrison rose from his seat in the front row. Major Kozlova, what's the current status of pilot recruitment for Phoenix operations? We have a waiting list of over 200 pilots requesting Phoenix training, she replied. Many are personnel who were grounded due to medical conditions or psychological concerns following traumatic incidents. They've discovered that aircraft designed for resurrection attract people who understand the process personally. The observation drew murmurs of understanding from the audience. Phoenix pilots weren't just operators of modified aircraft. They were living examples of the same resurrection philosophy that brought damaged fighters back to operational status. What about long-term sustainability? Asked Colonel Matthews from his position with the intelligence representatives. Phoenix operations are self-sustaining, Valentina answered. Every successful mission provides data that improves our modification techniques. Every pilot we return to active duty becomes a teacher for the next generation. The program grows stronger through experience. She paused, looking out at the assembled personnel who represented every aspect of military aviation. But the most important sustainability factor is philosophical. Once you understand that broken things can be made better than they were originally, you start seeing opportunities instead of limitations everywhere you look. The presentation concluded with a video montage of Phoenix aircraft in operation, taking off from damaged runways, performing maneuvers that defied conventional wisdom, landing safely after missions that would have been impossible for standard fighters. The images showed not just mechanical achievement, but human triumph over circumstances that had once seemed insurmountable. As the audience filed out for the reception, Valentina remained on stage, looking at the statistics that represented so much more than numbers. Each restored aircraft meant pilots who could fly again, missions that succeeded instead of failed, personnel who'd learned that their worst experiences could become their greatest strengths. Through the auditorium windows, she could see aircraft moving across the runway, some standard fighters, some Phoenix modified, all carrying pilots who understood that the sky forgave everything if you were brave enough to return to it. The evening reception buzzed with conversations about technical specifications and operational deployment schedules, but Valentina found herself drawn to a quieter corner where a group of Phoenix pilots had gathered. These were people who'd experienced their own resurrections, and their discussions carried the weight of shared understanding. Major Kozlova, said Captain Lisa, Reborn Tours, one of the first pilots to undergo Phoenix training after a crash that had left her with chronic pain. I wanted to thank you for giving me back my wings. You earned them back yourself, Valentina replied. I just helped you understand that wings don't break as easily as we think they do. Lieutenant Colonel David, Second Chance, Kim joined the conversation, his Phoenix pin gleaming against his dress uniform. The program has changed how we think about failure, he observed. Instead of career-ending events, we're learning to see them as opportunities for improvement. Around them, other Phoenix pilots nodded in recognition. These were people who'd been declared unfit for flight duty due to injuries, psychological trauma, or incidents that had shattered their confidence. Through Phoenix training, they'd learned that resurrection wasn't just possible, it was a skill that could be developed and refined. "What's next for the program?" asked Major Sarah, Phoenix Rising Chen, whose aircraft had been shot down over hostile territory before being rebuilt as a Phoenix-class fighter. Valentina looked around the group, seeing in their faces the same determination she'd found in her own reflection during the darkest days after her squadron's crash. "International expansion," she said. "Allied nations want Phoenix training for their own programs. We're going to teach the world that broken things can fly again." The implications were staggering. Phoenix philosophy spreading beyond the American military, creating a global network of personnel who understood resurrection as both technical skill and personal journey. Aircraft and pilots supporting each other across national boundaries, united by the understanding that trauma could become strength if properly channeled. "Will you be leading the international program?" Kim asked. She hadn't expected the question, but the answer came without hesitation. "If that's where the mission leads." She looked through the reception hall windows at aircraft silhouetted against the evening sky. "Phoenix pilots go where they're needed most." The group fell into comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts about missions accomplished and challenges yet to come. Around them, the reception continued with technical discussions and strategic planning sessions, but in their quiet corner, they shared the deeper understanding that connected all Phoenix personnel. They were living proof that the human spirit, like carefully modified aircraft, could not only survive seemingly impossible trauma but emerge stronger, more capable, more determined than ever before. The desert stars began appearing through the windows, and Valentina remembered another evening 3 years ago when she'd watched the same stars from a mountain valley where Phoenix had died. Now, those stars witnessed her surrounded by people who'd learned the same lesson she had. Sometimes you had to crash completely before you could learn to truly fly. 1 year later, Valentina stood on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, watching Phoenix-modified naval aircraft launch for combat missions over the Pacific. The carrier's deck crew worked with practiced efficiency, but she could see the extra care they took with the Phoenix aircraft. These machines represented something more than military hardware. "Admiral Rodriguez sends his compliments," reported Commander Jackson, the carrier's air wing commander. "Phoenix operations have exceeded all projected performance metrics."